Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Sneha, a freelance makeup artist based in London, and today I'm going to be sharing swatches, 3 looks, and also a review on the new Viseart Paris Love Letter palette. So if you'd like to see more about this palette, please continue watching. So this is what the palette looks like. Absolutely beautiful packaging, made of cardboard, and on the back says Paris Love Letter, and then you can open this right here and then you get information regarding the palette, so shelf life, how many grams of product are in there, made in the US, etc. And in here you get a decent sized mirror, and these are the 12 shades you get. All the shade names are mentioned on the back of the outer packaging of the palette. So it's right here, and then this is what the front looks like. So this is what the palette looks like inside. And this is inspired by the vision of Paris in springtime. So I'm thinking of a garden with like fresh grass and then flowers in different colors, mostly being lighter in tone, just based on the color scheme of this palette. It's very light in tone, if that makes sense. And as with other Viseart palettes from both the Étendue collection or with the Petite Four collections, or even now their fuller size palettes, each of these pans is removable. So it has a notch right here, and you can remove these pans. Now in terms of pan size, these are at 1.5 grams for each pan. So these sit right in between the 1 gram for the edit palettes versus the 2 grams for the full size larger Viseart palettes. So at 1.5 grams for each of these pans, you can mix and match either within the palette or with Petite Fours, so they are the same size as these, or even the other Violet Étendue palette, that's the same size as this. This palette retails for $44 in the US and £36 here in the UK, and you get 18 grams of product in here. So that brings the price per gram to £2, which I think is considerably cheap, considering that it's Viseart quality eyeshadows. Next, let's have a closer look at these eyeshadows and also at these swatches. The first shade is Letterbox, and it's a matte finish, and I think it's more of a light peachy beige kind of a tone. On my skin tone, I like to use this more as a brow bone highlighter. I haven't really tried it as an all-over eyelid shade, but that's something to consider. You can do that as well. The next shade over is the shade Beloved, and I would describe this more of a light champagne gold, and this has a satin finish. Next to it is the shade Charmed, which is a beautiful peachy shade, and this is in a metallic finish. The last shade in this row is called Chocolatier, and it's a nice deep dark neutral brown, so it's great to go with all the tones in this palette, so both warm and cool tones. I love using this both as an eyeliner or also to deepen all my eye looks, because there's no other shade that's deep enough to intensify any look, at least on my skin tone. Second row, first shade is the shade Sonnet. This is also a light peach, but slightly deeper than the shade Letterbox. This is like a light transition kind of a shade on my skin tone. Right next to it is the shade Cupid, again a matte shade, and it's a beautiful coral kind of a tone. Right next to it is probably the shade that got most people's attention when this palette was launched, which is the shade Blooming. It's a beautiful yellow-green tone and is a satin finish. The last shade from the second row is the shade Love Blonde, which is more of a yellow-based orange and is a matte finish. Again, it's a light shade, so it acts more like a transition shade on my skin tone. Last row first shade is Arrow, which is like a neutral medium brown. Again, matte finish. Next we have Poem. I would describe this as a light pink with a metallic finish. Next to it is probably one of my favorite shades from the palette, which is Amour, which is a beautiful light lavender kind of a tone with a soft satin finish. And last but not the least, the shade Ballad, which is like a more silver taupey kind of a tone. It looks absolutely stunning, and this is in a metallic finish. Look number 1 is this beautiful silver lavender kind of a look. For all 3 looks, I've started with primed eyelids with my favorite, which is the NARS Eye Primer in Clear. I'm first taking the lighter shade from the palette, Letterbox, on a My Kit Co Pro 1.15 brush, and I'm using this shade as my brow bone highlight. I'm using the shade right below it, the shade Sonnet. I'm going to use that more as a transition shade, and you can see that there's not much difference between these two shades on my skin tone. Next, with the same brush, I'm using the shade Cupid, which is more of that coral shade, and I'm using that as my crease color. The shade does show up on my skin tone, as you can see. Next, I tried to deepen up the crease with the shade Arrow, but as you can see, it didn't really add much depth. Next, I'm using the shade Chocolatier from the palette on a My Kit Go Pro 1.14 brush. I'm using this to define along my lower lash line, also extending it up and creating this V shape on the outer corner of my eye, then gradually just building up with the shade Chocolatier and gradually bringing in the shade into the crease as well. Next, I'm using the shade Amour, which is this beautiful light lavender kind of a tone in the palette. And I'm taking that on a My Kit Go 1.5 brush, using it damp with the Isa mixing media and applying it 3/4 of the eyelid, leaving the inner corner blank for the next shade. This is an absolutely stunning shade and I really love this one. Next, using a My Kit Go 3.3 brush with the shade Ballad, and I'm going to use it again damp with the Isa mixing medium and applying it to the inner corner of my eye, both on the top and the bottom eyelid. Now here I'm just blending the edges between the two shades and then going back in with the peachy shade Cupid on the My Kit Go Pro 1.14 brush and just adding a little bit of peach that was lost in the transition area. Lastly, I'm adding a nude pencil to the waterline and finishing off this look with mascara. And that completes the eye look. For blush, I'm using the Danessa Myricks Vision Flush in the shade Bread and Butter. And I'm applying that with the Co-Artistry Tools brush 1.4. And on my lips, I have a combination of the MAC lip pencil in the shade Whirl, so applied it all over. And then going in with the Danessa Myricks Nude Glaze in the shade Macaron. And that completes look number 1. I absolutely love how this look turned out, and this I think is my favorite look that I created with this palette. Moving on to look number 2, which is this neutral peachy brown kind of a look. Again, starting off this look with the brow bone highlight, so I'm going in with the shade Letterbox on a My Kit Go Pro 1.15 brush. Next, with the same brush, I'm going into the shade Lovelorn. And as you can tell, I was trying to build up the shade, but again, it doesn't look like much on my skin tone. But that's what I used as a transition shade. Next, I used the shade Arrow with the Sigma E25 brush, and I thought that might add some depth to the crease. But again, as you can see, it just very lightly defines the crease, and it almost gets covered up when I use the next shade. Next, I'm going into the shade Chocolatier with the My Kit Go 3.3 brush and running it along my bottom lash line. And again, like look number 1, going to extend it up towards the top eyelid or the outer corner of the top eyelid and create like this cat eye shape. And then going back and forth between this brush and the Sigma E25 to use as a blending brush. So adding more color with the My Kit Go brush and then blending it out with the Sigma brush. Next, I went in with the peachy shimmery shade from the palette, which is Charmed. And I'm going to use it dry first just to show you the difference. I'm applying that with the My Kit Go 1.5 brush. You can see how much more softer it is compared to the other eye where I've used it damp. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to use the shade damp with the Isa Pro Mixing Medium. You can see how much more intense that is. Blending the edges away with the Sigma brush. Then using the shade Beloved on my inner corner with the same My Kit Go brush. And then just going back and intensifying that dark brown shade Chocolatier along the lower lash line and the outer V of the eye. And then finishing off this look with the MAC Eye Kohl in the shade Teddy on my bottom waterline. And with mascara. And that completes the eye look. On my cheeks, I have the Danessa Myricks Vision Flush in the shade Ballet Slippers. It's more of a peachier tone than the first shade. And then as my highlight, I have the Danessa Myricks Vision Flush in the shade Tiara. And on my lips, I have the Lisa Eldridge lipstick in Velvet Affair. And this completes look number 2. I really enjoyed how this look turned out. just that the colors are not very unique, so I can recreate this possibly with another palette as well. Look number 3 is this fresh look inspired by the green and the coral tones in the palette. So I'm starting with a mix of the shades Sonnet and Cupid on a My Kid Co Pro 1.15 brush. I'm applying that as my crease color. And then with the same brush, I'm going to use the shade Letterbox as my brow bone highlight. Then deepening up the crease a little bit with the shade Cupid on a smaller brush this time. This is the My Kid Co Pro 1.14 brush. So applying that through my crease and also along my lower lash line, connecting it at the outer corner of the eye. Then I'm using a flat brush from the brand Kit Stars. It's the S32 shader brush. And I'm using the green shade from the palette, Blooming. I'm using it damp with the Esa mixing medium, just because I wanted intensity on the eyelid. So I'm just gradually building that shade up on the entire eyelid, leaving the inner corner empty. Next, I'm using the shade Poem with the Refer 03 brush, applying it damp to the inner corner of my eye. And lastly, I'm going to take an angled brush. This is by the brand Kit Stars. It's the S41 short angle. I'm going into the shade Chocolatier, but with the damp brush. So I'm using the Esa mixing medium and using the brush damp to get more intensity from this brown shade. And just stamping it along my top lash line and creating a small wing, just using the length of the brush actually. So this kind of helps grounding this otherwise very soft look. And then finishing off this eye look with some mascara on my top and bottom lashes. And then using the Danessa Myricks Vision Flush in Ballet Slippers as my blush. And the Danessa Myricks Nude Glaze in the shade Cappuccino on my lips. So that's one lip option. I felt like it needed a little bit more peachy tone, so I added a little bit of the Lisa Eldridge Velvet Affair lipstick right on top. And this completes look number 3. I think this look is just perfect for this time of the year as we roll into spring. Very soft yet fresh. And in case you're curious about what I have on my eyes, I have the Danessa Myricks Color Fix. I've used these 3 shades in a combination for the base. And then I've gone in with the shade Blooming, which is that beautiful green shade, right through the center of my eye. And this is probably more like how I would use this palette, honestly, just because it seriously lacks depth in my opinion. Personally, I think that this is more suited for fair to light to maybe light medium skin tones, because most of these shades, especially the lighter mattes like these, probably will show up differently on their skin tone. On my skin tone, I can honestly use 1, 2, 3, and 4 shades like interchangeably, especially 1, 2, and 3. Those shades definitely interchangeably. They almost dust off and don't really add depth to my look. The shades amongst the mattes anyway that I can kind of use is this peachy shade called Cupid and then the dark brown shade called Chocolatier. So with almost all the looks, I've had to incorporate the dark brown just because that's the only dark shade from this palette to kind of ground any of the looks on my skin tone anyway. So that I feel is a con in this palette. There's not enough depth. Thankfully, the brown in this palette is like a nice neutral tone, so it goes well with both warm and cool toned looks that I can create from this palette. Personally, I plan to use this palette in conjunction with other palettes such as Milieu or my Grande Pros, just because I can then fall on those palettes for depth and use these more like a pop of color. So say I want to use the lavender shade, I can also go into the Tondu Violette palette to create a soft purple look, but I don't think I'll be using this palette just on its own. My favorite shades from this palette, as I mentioned before, are these 3, the 3 from the column and Ballad. And as I mentioned before, the only 2 mattes that I really can get some color to show on my eyes are Cupid, which is the peachy shade or the coral shade, and then Chocolatier, which is the neutral dark brown. So if you're of a similar skin tone as mine and you're okay with soft light wash of color, those kind of looks, you can consider getting this. But if you like depth like I do, I would probably skip on this palette. Or if you're like me, you've already purchased this, but to get intensity, you can definitely invest in a good mixing medium. So that way you can get some shine and intensity with some of the satin and metallic shades in this palette. Honestly, I would have liked to see these guys replaced, at least one of or two of these shades replaced, maybe add in a deeper green or a deeper purple, just so that it can tie in with some of these pops of colors in this palette. I feel like that would have made this palette a little bit more cohesive and would have added some depth in this otherwise a very light palette, I would say. Also, for the metallics, I would have liked to see more difference between these two shades. I would have preferred this shade to be slightly more deeper and more rosy in tone, if that makes sense. Because on my skin tone, or even for deeper skin tones, I feel like these two shades would more or less look the same as an inner corner highlight or all over the eyelid. So in conclusion, I would have to say that this is probably my least favorite Viseart palette up to date, which is surprising. I never thought I would say that, but it is. It's just very soft for my personal liking. But then again, not every palette is meant for everybody, if that makes sense. So if you are someone who really loves softer looks, definitely check out this palette. It has beautiful tones and some unique shades, I would say, especially these two right here are absolutely stunning, even as a wash of color. Let me know in the comment section below if you're considering purchasing this palette or if you're going to give it a pass. But if you enjoyed the video, definitely give this video a like and also consider subscribing for more videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!